Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to this morning's webinar on COVID-19 vaccinations, the new workplace challenge. For those who don't know me, my name is Machado. I'm the National Practice Leader at the Health and Safety Department at Aon, and I'll be chairing today's session. Just before we kick off, some housekeeping. Just make sure the tech is working. Today's session is being recorded, so you'll be able to get access to not only the recording but the slides at the end of the session. I'll explain that a little bit later on. You've all joined in on listen-only mode, and you can ask questions throughout the presentation using the questions window on your control panel. But just note that we've got over 1,600 people dialing in today, so we'll do our best to try and get through all the questions, but we'll be holding a Q&A session at the end where hopefully we'll get a chance to consolidate some of your questions. In addition to this, I'd also like to advise that we've extended the session by 15 minutes today. With the amount of interest that we've had on today's webinar and the content, we thought it'd be worthwhile just extending the session by 15 minutes. So hopefully you can all hang on for another 15 minutes or so. For those who can't, you obviously get a recording of the session and you'll be able to catch up at the end. Joining me today, we've got a number of speakers. Trent Sebbins, who's a partner from Ashurst, he's joining us this morning, obviously talking about the legal framework and the laws. Rob Tanti, General Manager of People and Culture at SPC, is also joining us, telling us a little bit about the SPC story, who we all, I think, by now know a little bit about. So that's going to be a fascinating section of the webinar. And a couple of colleagues of mine, Kaylin Brennan, who's the placement leader in the workers' compensation team, and Paul Smith, who's a placement director within our broking part of the business. So welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining us. In terms of agenda and just really setting the scene, I don't think that there's any more important topic than COVID-19 and vaccinations at the moment. So over the next hour and a quarter, we're going to be exploring, before we get onto the detail, really just exploring the state of the nation, reflecting on what's happened over the last 6 months or so, and then Trent's going to take us through some of the legal frameworks and the law side of things, followed by Rob Tanti is going to be telling us through, or taking us through, the SPC story, which is a really important part of this whole conversation that we're having around vaccines. And then at the very back end of the session, we'll be exploring a number of things to do with workers' compensation, as well as some insurance implications. So that's the agenda for the next hour and a quarter, yeah, it's going to be a really good session. So it's really important that as we think about the future, and really what we're talking about today is really about the future and the implications of vaccinations in the workplace. In many ways, reflecting on the past will give us some insights on what the future will look like. And as you can see by the slide here, we've been thinking about what's really transpired over the last 18 months or so. And if you reflect on the pandemic dating back to last year, the first couple of waves was our first experience with the pandemic, and you can see by the time we got to the second wave, really that was becoming, well, it certainly felt for those based in Victoria and Melbourne, that the second wave was really a Melbourne issue, and certainly when you read the media reports, it kind of felt that way. And then when you compare the infection rates between July of last year through to Christmas and even into early of this year, when you look at those infection rates there compared to the rest of the world, it almost felt like in many ways that we didn't really have an issue in Australia. Infection rates were very low. Community infection rates in particular were very low. And then as we start thinking about vaccinations in the workplace, it's hard to believe that Pfizer was only approved on the 25th of January of this year, and AstraZeneca in February of 2021. So when we reflect on what we're talking about today, in many ways, our mindsets and people's perceptions around vaccines, and in particular vaccines in the workplace, is really bound by experiences. And on that, we really have only been talking about vaccinations for a short period of time. And then, of course, everything changed when Delta hit our shores. The first case of Delta variant was identified in May of 2021 in Sydney. So, and obviously, I think we all know what's transpired since then, and community transmission rates have just been accelerating ever since. So, again, as we continue to reflect, and judging by some of the media coverage, in particular around vaccinations, back in March of 2021, I think it's been widely reported that there was no race around the vaccine, and that was soon changed to this article here in the media, which was around really Scott Morrison conceding that the vaccine rollout was a race. Now there's lots of detail behind all of that, but think about the media and what's transpired over the last 6 months or so. The messaging through the press has really changed quite a lot. So in the absence of any sort of national guidance or policy, industry really took hold of this, and SPC were the first employer to mandate mandatory COVID-19 vaccinations to all staff, and really that was built around the back of risk and wanting to do the right thing for employees' welfare, and obviously we'll hear from Rob shortly. So that was only the 4th of August is when SPC announced this. And then other employers followed suit. Qantas and Virgin have also subsequently mandated mandatory vaccinations to employees. So the narrative around vaccinations in the workplace has really been evolving over the last few months. But so has other coverage around compensation claims and risk, and this has all created a lot of uncertainty, a lot of questions by a lot of employers around, okay, well, what does this mean for us? And the narrative just keeps evolving. Every day there seems to be a new article around vaccine passports or other types of measures, but certainly when you look at the narrative over the last few months, there's certainly pace gathering around this whole issue around vaccinations, and particular vaccinations in the workplace. So where we find ourselves now is that transmission rates in Victoria yesterday were the highest all year, so 463 transmission cases yesterday, and the same thing in New South Wales. So the likelihood of us flattening the curve seems unlikely now. The zero strategy no longer seems to be possible or feasible, and the lockdown roadmap in both Victoria and New South Wales just don't seem to be working, because even though we've got a very high rate of community transmission, don't forget that we've been in lockdown for weeks. So if community transmissions are what they are at the moment during lockdown, what's left to do? And the reality is that vaccine is now the strategy, and you can see that the whole narrative around vaccinations is really shifted and changed over the last week, 2 weeks. It's all changed. So when we think about vaccinations and the future, by all accounts, the forecast is that by about November, 80% of the eligible population will be vaccinated. So this slide gives us 2 or 3 bits of information. The first one is that's what it'll look like in terms of vaccinations, but what it also says is that this is working on the assumption that that community transmission is going to be happening all the time, and judging by the current rates in both New South Wales and Victoria, that's certainly likely to be the case. So we've got a double whammy of we've got community transmission, and the only risk control, if we use that language that we use in health and safety all the time, the only risk control strategy that we've got is really around vaccinations. So the question that we need to be asking ourselves is how will we live in a COVID-19 world, because certainly that's where the future is looking, and how will workplaces function in this new world of ours, because we've just accepted the fact that community transmissions will continue to evolve, and we know that vaccinations is the only strategy. So what does this mean for us as employers? What does it mean for our employees, and what does it mean for us living in this new world? Recognising that in amongst all of this, that there's risk, and this article here was published in the media a couple of days ago only, off the back of Queensland Police announcement that they were mandating COVID-19 vaccinations. So in amongst all of this, there's lots of confusion around what we can and can't do. So the four real things or key issues that we're going to be exploring today, and really this underpins our whole conversation today, is really built around, from a values perspective, what's the right thing to do, and how do we strike a balance between employer obligations and individual rights, given this new landscape that we're going into. What are the legal frameworks, and what can we do and what can't we do in terms of legal obligations, both for employers and employees, and how could or should employers consider vaccination strategies in the workplace, because ultimately it's not so much about what we do, it's how we do it as employers. And then inevitably, when things go wrong, and things will go wrong, how do we manage some of this risk, both in terms of workers' compensation and general insurance? So with this in mind, Trent, I think we're all keen to hear from you in terms of the legal implications. So perhaps just take us through that.
Thanks very much, Mario, and good morning to everyone. This is obviously a topic of great interest to all of you, and certainly something that has been very topical over the course of this present year, and we've seen a significant shift in that discourse on vaccinations from the start of the year, when you'll recall that there were a lot of calls on the government, the Commonwealth government, to give guidance and clarification about whether or not employers could direct employees to be vaccinated, to then in the middle of this year, and most particularly in July and August, as the Delta variant outbreak started to take hold, in particular in New South Wales, with employers then announcing their own vaccination programs, and governments at state levels moving to mandate vaccinations for certain industries. It's quite apparent from that change in the discourse that employers will need to take the lead on vaccinations and implementing vaccination either encouragement or mandation policies, both as a part of the road to economic recovery for their own businesses, but for the Australian economy generally, as we attempt to come out of the pandemic, but also to ensure the health and safety of their workers, which is very critical, but also to their customers and clients that their businesses serve, and also, I would say, for the betterment of public health within the community. There are four critical legal issues that arise in considering mandatory vaccinations, or indeed just vaccination policies generally, even if that includes just declarations about vaccinations. And you'll see those on the screen. They are, and the first one has taken up a fair amount of the debate, whether or not mandating vaccinations by policy or direction would be a reasonable and lawful direction. What are an employer's or PCBU's, person conducting a business or undertakings, work health and safety obligations, and how does that intersect with a control measure of vaccinations? And then some implementation issues which concern discrimination and also privacy. Now, there'll be a number of other implementation issues in relation to consultation, which arises at both in general under enterprise agreements and awards if they are triggered, but also under work health and safety legislation. And then we'll have back-end issues in the employment sphere where we're dealing with potential disciplinary action. So let me deal firstly with lawful and reasonable directions, because it really has drawn a lot of the attention in the course of the debate and certainly has been a focus of government guidance. Now, I think it's safe to say by this stage that the common wisdom amongst employment lawyers is that it would be a reasonable and lawful direction to an employee to require them to be vaccinated, depending upon the circumstances of the particular work that they are performing and the industry of their employer, and also the location of that employer. Now, we've seen some great debate upon this. Certainly, the unions and the peak body, the ACTU, has said that vaccination should be voluntary, but coupled together with a comprehensive education campaign for workers and for the community. And we've certainly seen in the last week or so the ACTU bring out its own media campaign encouraging vaccinations. But I think it is the case that unions have generally not supported mandatory vaccination policies and have campaigned for this to remain a free choice for workers. As a result of the earlier discourse in the year and pressure from employer associations and employers at large, we have seen government agencies, including Safe Work, who's the agency responsible for development and publication of safety measures for COVID risks, publishing its own guidance that came out in February initially, which was that it was unlikely that a requirement for workers to be vaccinated would be reasonably practicable as a control measure. Now, that advice has changed over the course of the year and was updated significantly in the middle of the year, taking an industry focus, but directing attention to the Fair Work Ombudsman guidance. Now, that guidance, published right at the start of the year, again, was that employers should take it that for the overwhelming majority of them, they should assume that they won't be able to require their employees to be vaccinated against coronavirus. Now, as the Delta variant really started to take hold, we have seen, and in particular on the 6th of August, after the Prime Minister made an announcement, updated advice providing for 4 tiers in which an employer might fall into one of those categories, which effectively then provides a starting point for an assessment about whether or not it might be reasonable to mandate vaccinations. From the highest tier being those who are at highest risk, working in hotel quarantine or border control, to the next level being healthcare and aged care, through to tier 3, which is, for example, stores that provide essential goods and services, and then the last tier being effectively everyone else, including those who work from home. Now, I think that, as I've said, is a very useful starting point, but it is not the end of the analysis. And most critical in the analysis is the work health and safety obligations and what employers really need to do to determine for themselves what is the risk that is posed by the contraction and spread of coronavirus in their workplaces to their workers, and how do they go about considering those risks and developing a position and perhaps a policy on that front. So let's then turn to look at those factors, which we'll see on the next slide. Those factors that we say should be ones taken into consideration are primarily based upon risk, and it is this risk-based approach to assessing whether or not workers and your business is exposed to a risk of contraction and spread of COVID. But you'll see it is not, in our view, simply limited to safety risk, although that is certainly primary. The risk includes risks posed to workers as well as others, including customers, suppliers, and visitors to the workplace, but also the risk to the business and its continuity if there was a case of COVID in the particular workplace or an outbreak in the workplace, and also a continuity of public health and or welfare considerations, including in respect of super spreader risks. Now, it might be attractive for employers to assume or to attempt to ride a wave of support for vaccinations based upon what other employers are doing, or there to be a groundswell of a movement of vaccination policies. But there really is no substitute that an employer can put in place then undertaking their own risk assessment focused on their business and the work of their employees. Now, I think the simplest approach in doing that, and you would have all developed COVID safe plans during the course of last year and have undertaken risk assessments that underpin those COVID safe plans. The best approach is to then take those risk assessments and to refresh them based upon the state of the pandemic right at the moment, and also to reassess the control measures, which do now include vaccines. The time you would have developed your COVID safe plans, vaccines just simply were not a control measure which was available to employers, and therefore mandating vaccinations just simply was not in scope. So to assist in developing the policy and also managing an employer's work health and safety obligations, and I would say further than that, establishing that you are able to develop a policy or issue a direction which is both lawful and reasonable, we say that you should take into account these relevant factors. I've spoken briefly about the first one, but let me expand upon that, and that is the risk to workers primarily based upon the business or the industry, but also their location and health advice that you might receive or be able to garner from publicly available health information. Now, that risk that is posed to workers may be different depending upon their geographical location, the nature of the duties they performed, in particular, whether or not they work in close proximity with fellow workers, whether they're engaging with large members of the public or large groups of other workers, and also whether or not they come into contact with people who are either essential workers and that there is a relevant consideration in respect of spreading the disease to those persons, or coming in contact with vulnerable persons who are vulnerable to severe consequences of contracting COVID-19. Now, that risk assessment in respect of those types of duties might result in some variable risk across the business, both geographic locations and also duties. But depending upon the nature of your business, if you have a national business, I think it is, having undertaken that risk assessment, still open to you to decide to implement a common approach. Obviously, for businesses that are located within a particular city or state and where the pandemic is prevalent, take for example at the moment in New South Wales and most particularly Sydney or perhaps Melbourne, then the risk is going to be quite prevalent. And if your business is concentrated or located in that particular place, then it would seem that the risk is quite prevalent. As compared to perhaps if you have a business which is only based in Perth, then at the moment, the likelihood of the contraction and spread of COVID-19 in the workplace would seem to be somewhat reduced. So that is, I think, the important and most critical element in the risk assessment, but there are a number of others. And one of those includes obligations which is imposed by third parties, and also obligations which are imposed by public health authorities. We're starting to see across businesses that for suppliers, that certain businesses are mandating that suppliers or people who visit particular workplaces are vaccinated, and that this will be checked. If that is imposed upon your business, then obviously that's a factor to take into account, and perhaps almost will be inevitable that then you need to require your workers who interact with those particular workplaces or other third-party businesses to also be vaccinated, because they won't otherwise be able to do their jobs. Obviously, public health orders is a critical consideration, and in New South Wales in particular, we're seeing public health orders which have mandated the requirement for at least one dose of vaccine for local government areas designated of areas of concern. If authorised workers, that is a limited list of those who can move out of their local government area if it's an area of concern to work at a workplace outside of that area, have to be vaccinated with at least one dose or have a certificate which provides that they have a medical contraindication. So for businesses perhaps who have workers located in those areas, it's quite clear that would be a factor that would be taken into account in mandating a policy, or putting in place arrangements so that you can check that those workers themselves are vaccinated. For particular other industries or sectors, we are also seeing, although incrementally, the government starting to announce mandatory vaccinations. So we've already seen aged care for residential care facilities, airport and quarantine workers in New South Wales. We're now seeing a mandating requirement for teachers and healthcare workers, as well as for police on New South Wales construction sites as well. We have seen that for Greater Sydney, and in other states we're starting to see similar mandating requirements under public health orders or directions being issued by governments. Clearly, if you're in one of those sectors, some of these other elements will either take a less significant role or will start to fall away, and you'll just have to implement a mandatory vaccination policy because you are required to do so under public health orders. Another critical consideration is business continuity risk, and that includes the risk to your business if it is shut down by an order of a public health authority, as well as reputational risk for having an outbreak in your workplace, and also, I would say, the impact upon public welfare if there was an outbreak in your workplace that spread to the local community. That brings up one of the other items which you'll see on the list, which is super spreader risk. And that really is similar to the last point I've made, which is either a super spreader event in your own workplace or which then spills out into the local surrounding area. Now, it may be more prevalent in particular types of workplaces where there is a great volume of people who come and go from a particular business, or in, for example, businesses where there is a visiting of other workplaces, perhaps in transport and logistics, where you can see where that super spreader risk is more prevalent, but is certainly a relevant consideration in determining whether or not to implement a policy. Two other factors which I won't dwell upon, but to mention briefly, are the safety, leadership and social responsibility requirements, which intersect with those public health and safety or welfare considerations that we've mentioned, but also just taking a leadership position in your industry to implement such a policy. But also, and this is a very significant and practical consideration, which is the efficacy and availability of vaccines. And by efficacy, I mean, what does the vaccine control? How effective is it as a control measure? And how does it assess or get assessed against other control measures? Now, most employers who are looking at these matters are not removing the other COVID-safe controls that they've got in place, such as workplace hygiene, social distancing, hand sanitation, and the like. They are adding vaccinations as an additional layer of protection in accordance with the hierarchy of controls, because this is now an available measure which might, together with those factors, lead to a greater minimisation, so far as is reasonably practicable, of the risk of contraction of spread of vaccines in the workplace, of COVID-19, through vaccines in the workplace. Now, we perhaps all are aware that vaccinations don't mean that a person won't catch the virus. Certainly there can be breakthrough infections, but it does, based upon the current medical evidence, prevent the spread, because those who are vaccinated tend to not develop serious disease. Therefore, they carry a significantly less viral load. Therefore, they're less likely to either generate aerosols or otherwise spread it in other ways to co-workers or people that they come into contact with. So that is a relevant factor, but it is not a substitute for some of those other measures, and they do need to be maintained. The availability of vaccines has certainly changed over the course of the last year, and they are relatively more available. It's difficult to say that they're completely widely available, but it should be taken into account, that availability, in setting timelines if you are going to implement a policy for requiring people to be vaccinated, and when you set those timelines. That is, if vaccines are just not available for particular workers in your location, given their age group or the like, then you will need to take that into account on timing. Legal risk, as well as in respect of workers' compensation insurance, is also a relevant consideration, and we'll come to that towards the end of our discussion today. So having taken into account each of those factors, you might decide to mandate a policy, and you might want to consider what the scope of that policy is. So let's then turn to that consideration. What should be the scope of your policy? Now, having undertaken the risk assessment, you still might decide that you don't want to make it a mandatory policy. You simply want to keep it as voluntary. You might want to encourage employees to be vaccinated. You might want to issue a campaign, an education campaign about the benefits of vaccination. And you may want to go as far as to seek voluntary declarations about people, about their vaccination status. That's a decision for you, which should come out of your risk assessment. You might also want to consider whether or not you have a common policy that applies to all workers, or that it only applies to high-risk workers. You might also want to consider whether or not it applies across the board if you have a national business in each state or only in particular locations. I think there is, once you go through a risk assessment and you might assess the interactions between your workers as well as the simplicity of the policy and messaging, you might come to a decision that you want to have a common policy. And I think, having undertaken a risk assessment, there's an appropriate basis to do that. If you're going to implement it for employees, you might also want to consider whether or not you implement it also for visitors, contractors and suppliers, that is, that you could require them to be vaccinated and to provide you with proof of that. You will also likely come up with a policy that has some reasonable adaptations, and it's suggested that you do based upon discrimination grounds. Now, the standout discrimination grounds are in respect of disability. If a person has a medical contraindication that they should not be vaccinated, and there is information available from ATAGI about the number of medical contraindications where that is a recommendation, about how you deal with individuals who have such a disability and can't be vaccinated. And you might also want to turn your mind to whether or not you make an exception for genuinely held religious beliefs based upon the tenets of the religion that a person may have. That could be an express exception or some mechanism to assess whether or not the person falls within the exception or not. It's a matter for you to decide how you develop that. It is likely, though, that you will have a series of individuals who are simply conscientious objectors to vaccinations, or who, for whatever reason, perhaps simply vaccination hesitancy, who do not comply with your policy if you were to develop one which mandated vaccinations. Now, it's not set out here, but it will be obvious to you. You will need to decide, what do you do with those individuals who either cannot be vaccinated or who refuse to be vaccinated and who don't comply with your policy. For those who fall in the exception grounds, perhaps who have a disability or a religious belief, you might consider whether or not they can be redeployed to some other role, whether or not there's some other safety measures that could be implemented to permit them to continue to perform their duties, or whether they could work from home, or simply whether or not you unfortunately get to the position where they can't, you form the view they can't perform the inherent requirements of the role, and you need to make a decision about their employment. Similarly, for those individuals who refuse to comply with the policy or your direction, you will likely need to come to a decision about how you treat those individuals, and that is likely to be a disciplinary decision, perhaps including consideration of termination. That is most critically where you will come up against a test about whether or not your policy was or amounted to a lawful and reasonable direction. And we've certainly seen for flu vaccinations last year, in the first part of the pandemic, the Fair Work Commission having to turn its mind to whether or not a flu vaccination in a particular sector, which was childcare, amounted to a reasonable and lawful direction. That was the case of Good Start early learning. And in that particular case, for those workers, childcare workers in that industry, the Commission held that it was a reasonably practical measure and also then a lawful and reasonable direction. But that will turn upon your particular circumstances, your business, and the duties of your workers. Let's then turn lastly to considerations in respect of privacy. Now, if you're going to implement a mandatory vaccination policy, that is, that employees need to be vaccinated, you'll want to ensure that it's implemented and to check on whether or not employees have been vaccinated or not. Similarly, if you're going to implement it for others, such as suppliers, contractors, visitors, you may want to check their status as they attend your site. Now, gathering information in relation to vaccination status is, in our view, sensitive information because it is about the health status or the health condition of a particular individual, and that therefore requires consent unless you are required or authorised to collect it under a law, such as, for example, a public health order or some other law. There are none that immediately spring to mind. You will otherwise need free and willingly given consent. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't that you can't say to an individual if they don't consent, there's a consequence. That is, they may not be able to work, they may not be able to attend the site. as long as they understand the purpose for which the information is gathered, and you'll see those on the slide, compliance with health and safety obligations, and also to prevent a realistic risk of spread of COVID in the workplace. If those matters are made known to them, and they also told what the consequences are if they don't consent, then if they go about then giving you that status, that will amount to consent. The the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner has also given some guidance on this topic, and it's worthwhile having a look at that to consider what is being said by that Commissioner about collection of vaccination status information. But once you collect that information, knowing it is sensitive information, if it doesn't fall into the category of employee records exemptions, which I'll explain very briefly momentarily, you will need to apply the more stringent requirements of the Australian privacy principles to how you handle that information, store it and disclose it. If it is that is the vaccination status is information collected by the employer about their employees, consent will still be required at the outset, but once it is then in the hands of the employer, the APP stringencies in relation to sensitive information then don't apply. But just be aware, obviously, the employee records exemption doesn't apply to persons who aren't your employees or to third parties if you are to pass the information on to those third parties, perhaps including also within a group of companies. So those are the critical legal issues that arise, Mario. Obviously, SPC would have had to deal with a significant number of those. Let me hand back to you to introduce their experience, and Rob Tandy.
Thanks, Trent. Enormous amount of content in a very short period of time, so thanks for providing that overview. It's really useful. And if we now shift our minds to SPC, who would have thought that only 6-7 weeks ago there was no employer mandating vaccinations in the workplace. So the SPC story is an interesting one in many ways. We're very lucky to have Rob on the line, who's going to take us through the journey and the learning so far with SPC on this really important topic. So Rob, over to you.
Thanks Mario. Thank you, Trent, and welcome everybody. My appreciation to you all for making time to participate in something like this. Clearly it's a contentious point, it's a contentious decision we've made, and I'm sure particularly in fact, I know from the number of organisations that have contacted us directly that many employers are grappling with this and trying to understand exactly what is right for them. I know boards are challenging managers on, if we were to do this, how could we make this happen? And we've been active. Myself and our company secretary is also one of our directors and a lawyer. We've been very active in assisting some of our partner organisations and even some of our customer organisations in putting together their papers. So let's crack into it. It's a pleasure for me to be here. It's a pleasure for me to share our story. I think this is the most salient point from the TGA that was issued in July, that it was clear to us, and throughout this, that there was some very clear advice that is publicly available through ATAGI, TGA, Royal Australian College of General Practitioners, some of which I'll mention earlier. There's no shortage of information around there, and that reinforces the message that the most effective way to reduce deaths and severe illness is via vaccination. Next slide, please, Maya. So to give you a bit of a context, we had some very early discussions in our organisations with, in very early days for us, with health diseases experts, immunologists, epidemiologists. We had some high-level discussions with them, but we leveraged primarily the information that was publicly available, either from the Centers for Disease Control, the FDA in the USA, the Doherty report, the TGA I've already mentioned, the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners, and the ATAGI, and also articles that were coming out from mental health periodicals as well, and principally, and I guess many of us are living through this. You know, if you live in New South Wales or Victoria right now, where we're deep into a rather prolonged lockdown, and I don't know anybody that would call them fun. You know, where there have been increased calls, at least there's reporting that there are increased calls to Lifeline, based on up on the 2019 numbers, increasing Beyond Blue, and also the Kids Helpline. So it's clear to us that the impact of this is felt not only at a medical level, but also at a physical level, but also at emotional and mental level as well. You know, a point we spent a lot of our time on last week in particular with Are You OK Day, spending the whole week talking to people and dealing with matters of stress, dealing with stress and anxiety and so on. So there was enough information around there that, you know, had us thinking, hang on a minute, the Delta strain has changed everything. And I'll talk about this again later, are our safe work plans to respond to the Wuhan or the Alpha strain of COVID, are they sufficient to deal with the Delta strain? A little bit about us. You know, we're well known. We're a heritage brand. We've been around for about 100+ years. We have a foundation canning facility over at Shepparton. We've been part of the Shepparton fabric for many years. We also have a new manufacturing facility in Emu Plains in New South Wales. That Emu Plains provides fresh and frozen meals for NDIS. For us, therefore, business continuity is essential. Even though our products are shelf stable, they're well leveraged. They're available in less so for the food service industry, but more so for retail, and available for people in lockdown as well. Business continuity is absolutely essential for us. We have 730 workers at both sites, and that's outside of harvest season, and close to 1,000 in season. In fact, it could go up as high as 1,200 in season when we look at our December intake and January and February intake. So just to give you a sense of that, harvest for us, stone fruits are harvested. We take product from farmers in the local area, store it, process it rather intensely over the period between December and March, and even into April. And our workforce grows significantly from around about November, principally by seasonal workers. There's 112 staff at our Emu Plains facility, and they work in close proximity to each other. We have at both sites successful COVID safe plans in place, with many of the features that most of you, I'm sure, employers have in place: social distancing, frequent sanitation, frequent wash downs, hand sanitizers regularly available at every table, temperature checks on walk-in, face masks. We have a lot of that, and it was successful. But we thought that the Delta strain just didn't seem to be cooperating with many of the provisions that were already in place at the time. So our narrative really, we thought about, well, what is it? Why are we going to do this? Is essentially, we were essential services business. We took the view that our existing COVID safe plans were reasonably practicable and effective in minimising the risk of harm through transmission of the known strains, but that SARS-CoV-2, the Delta strain, in our view, was a game changer. It's much more contagious. It poses an elevated risk to our people, their families, and the communities. We are Shepparton based, and many of our employees, when you think about close to 700 staff or 500 staff that are based at Shepparton, live in and around Shepparton. Super spreader event at our Shepparton site will spread throughout the throughout the region. In fact, most recently, as you know, that there has been a lockdown event in Shepparton, where of the 60,000 odd population there, nearly 30% of them were in isolation for 14 days. 50% of our workforce were in isolation for 14 days as a consequence of that. Right now, at our Emu Plains site in New South Wales, we've had 2 positive tests about a week ago. That site has been in lockdown and shut for, it opens again on Friday. And so throughout all of that, there's the risk that we anticipated has come home in a very real way for us to deal with. Primarily behind all of this is we feel a really deep obligation to keep our people and communities safe. It's not just about our staff, it's also about the areas in which we live. We think that a new standard of reasonable practicable is necessary, and that our COVID safe plans should be revised, and that the safest option is a fully vaccinated workforce for our people. It was unlikely that governments were going to come forward with clear direction or a public health order that would mandate vaccination, almost like they have done in the States recently, for employees, unless it was in very special circumstances. The clear direction had to come from us. It had to come from enterprise, because it just wasn't coming from government. And on that basis, we chose to make a stand. And we were well aware of the risks, given that this was uncharted territory. We were well aware of the risks that we may enter into. Some of this could be litigated. We could be in the Fair Work Commission. We could inherit or attract all sorts of negative attention to ourselves, and we did. But we figured that what was required here was real leadership, and that the risk of dealing with a potential court case or losing a potential court case was far outweighed by the risk that was posed to our employees and the areas in which we live. Thank you. In the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the timeline. So this happened very, very quickly for us. It happened literally on a Saturday morning. The chairman called a conference call, and we all spoke about the concerns. He heard views from management, he heard views from other directors, and then he charged us over the weekend with looking to the potential risks involved in if we were going to mandate. So at that point, all of us spread around, started asking questions, doing our own research, talking to people that we knew, our contacts. Luckily, that many of our directors have some very heavyweight contacts in this area. Before we put a paper to board approval, 3 days later. And once we had board approval, we commenced consultation with our union and the employees, and we commenced we started with the implementation. And generally, the implementation was active communication with our employees. I'll go into details. We looked at revising our employee discipline process. We looked at revising our COVID policy that we had in place, and look at what amendments we needed to make to employment contracts, and that's for both the employees and for contractors that were with us. And now we're deep in the process of education, and I hate the word, but it's what we're doing is enforcement. Next slide, thanks, Mario. So a little bit about the program of work. Our objectives were that all staff that can be vaccinated, and that point I think needs to be made clear, in that it was clear to us, and we were aware from discussions with our people, that there were those that wanted to be vaccinated but couldn't for legitimate medical reasons. So that anybody that can be vaccinated must be vaccinated by January 1 as a condition of employment. That this rule applies to all visitors and contractors. Again, that can be vaccinated must be as a condition of engagement January 1. New employees, permanent and casual, to be fully vaccinated by January 1, 2022. and that we would seek about revising our COVID safe work plans. We agreed on the following principles: that our focus primarily would be on the welfare and well-being of our staff. We understood the contentiousness of this. We understood the inherent fear that people were dealing with, the reticence to receive vaccination, the plethora of information that was out there and misinformation that was fueling all sorts of fears, and chose really to focus primarily on their well-being and support. In many ways, we were building the plane and flying it at the same time. We understood, we set up a project plan that gave us the ability to pivot in an agile way when we learned of things from our people that needed to be addressed. We learned where we might need to challenge some of our original policy statements. The clear thing was to empower our staff with education and communication, and to engage them in open, transparent, and frequent conversation and dialogue. That was the key principles behind what we work, and the underpin everything we did going forward. So our stakeholders, we had identified those pretty early: government, union and industry associations, staff, media, and the public. The public, I think, was something that took us by surprise. So the pattern of visits to our Facebook page and our Instagram account went from, new hits of around about, new members of around about, hits in fact is the number, of about 500 a week, to in the first week after our announcement went to 20,000 hits. We underestimated, I think, the anti-vaxxers and their resourcefulness and their tenacity, and their campaign to steer people away from Mona and SPC, some of our brands. You could easily find on Twitter a hashtag account, boycott SPC. Interesting thing about that, it also provided the platform for those who were pro our decision to support us as well. Even though they sought to bring down or reduce our sales in fact increased marginally over the same period. So we looked at this from a number of streams and developed plans in order to address all of these things. Thanks, Mario. Excuse me. So the milestones, I think I've already gone through. That we made the announcement on the 5th. We went public on the 4th, but we spoke to our staff on the 5th. On the 15th, which is this Friday, in fact it's tomorrow, we have a requirement that they at least nominate a record of their registration with us, and they provide evidence of that. By the end of October, we expect that they receive their first dose, 30th November their second dose, and their deadline will be 1 January 2022. Now, at the time we put this policy together, there was a lot of AstraZeneca around, but there was enough press around, enough information around AstraZeneca for many people to be off it. But the availability around Moderna and Pfizer was restricted. We had many employees who were between the ages of 18 and 39, and as try as they may, could not register for a Pfizer vaccine, but could go for the AstraZeneca. We were not putting pressure on them to make a choice as to which vaccine, and so we made it really clear that we could flex on these timelines dependent on whether the vaccine was available, the vaccine of choice was available or not. We look to acknowledge efforts to vaccinate, that we had people amongst people in our team who wanted to receive the vaccine but were fearful of it, and who required counselling, required time with their doctors, and just required time to think about what was right for them. We afforded them that. We've got a few people who who fit into that bucket. But we were looking for evidence, and we maintain. So one of the things about mandating is that it means that we can and we do track employees' vaccination status. We ask for them to provide that to us, and right now we're looking at about 70% of our workforce. That there's 100% in our Emu Plains site, and close to 70% of our Shepparton site that have either registered, received their first dose or second dose. All those records are maintained by safety professionals and my team in human resources, and we do provide exemptions on medical grounds and medical and religious grounds where they have come forward. But to date, we haven't received any religious exemptions. Next slide, thanks. So some of our consultation features. I think many of you who would have read the press at the time would have noted that the AMWU were particularly critical of us, and that we, as they assert, we didn't meet our consultation obligations. Well, we complied with our obligations to consult, as has been agreed with the AMWU in our EBA. In fact, in our consultation sessions, their advice to us was, look, if you could just remove the word mandate and make it voluntary, we'll support you. And we just didn't think that was sufficient for us. But we meet weekly with AMWU and our shop stewards. We have weekly on-site town hall meetings, and we conduct them by shift. Although right now they're restricted because of the lockdown in Shepparton, but we're augmenting that by providing toolbox talk sheets for each of our production leaders and our team leaders to have closer, more intimate conversations with our people on site. We have weekly virtual town halls with all staff. I've spoken about the toolbox talks. We've set up a dedicated COVID helpline and also a COVID email address and a COVID landing page button on our internet account. Many of our staff, for instance, don't have email accounts. Some of them are casuals. We do have their personal email accounts, and so we augment personal emails to their accounts, particularly during the lockdown for us, where most of our staff couldn't keep in touch with our business. We were sending them weekly updates, daily updates on the COVID status, lockdown status. We would curate for them the hotspots and share that with them, and to the point where some of our staff were even sharing it with their contacts outside with other organisations who were finding the information around hotspots, tier 1, tier 2 sites to be too complicated to work through. Frequent executive and manager walkarounds, one-on-one consultations on request. We had FAQs that we designed and developed based on the questions that we were receiving. We did send daily email and SMS updates. We called our staff who were calling out for help, and we just make sure that no matter what, there was an executive present. So myself, the COO, the CEO, the General Manager of Operational Excellence, Quality and Innovation, spent a great deal of time walking the floor, talking with people pre-lockdown around their concerns. So the support we've got, we've offered our staff. So there is a dedicated resource. So the individual who's been assigned for that is a lovely person. She is the rehabilitation and workplace wellbeing coordinator for us. She has a dedicated line. People can call her, leave messages. We have a dedicated resource, staff support desk and emails. I've mentioned the dedicated landing page. We have guest experts coming to speak with us at our town halls. We record those and email them out to individuals. We've got a great one on this Friday where Stephen Tong, who's a associate professor epidemiology at the Doherty Institute, is coming to talk to us. We offer them 2 days additional leave if they suffer vaccination side effects, particularly for perm employees. On request from our staff who are having trouble getting appointments with doctors, we drafted for them a standard pro forma letter that they could take to the doctor. Feedback we got from our staff that was really helpful in opening their doors for them and accelerating registration. We offer 1 day paid leave for casual staff. We offer 2 hours time off to attend vaccination appointments. We just weekly updates on adjustments to rules. So there's a $50 gift voucher on full vaccination. There's support and personal registration. So there are those in our staff, in our team, who have some difficulty in writing and receiving emails. There are staff who have some difficulty navigating their way through registration for vaccination. We've converted a lot of that to paper-based support where we can. We sit down with them personally. We coach them through the registration process where they need help, and we offer that daily. And we've set up a collaboration with local vaccination hubs where there are appointments that are open, people have failed to show up, they can call us and we can liberate people to go and receive a vaccine. Again, of course, we're very clear about the type of vaccine that's available, but we offer that up and we ask people to make the choices. So I think it's one of these things for us, is that we just can never provide enough support. The idea here to run this as an agile program is to stay in touch as best we possibly can with our people. So we thought about our risks. What do we do with medical exemption? We said we deal with those on a case-by-case basis. They did need to provide medical records, and we've received some of those already. And that for those, we would develop bespoke safety precautions with the employee. We would engage with the employee and come up with something that they would feel more comfortable with. Again, it's difficult to have a one rule fits all because every scenario is most likely to be different, and we envisage that. What would happen if there weren't enough vaccines available? We look to allow flexibility of timelines, provide letters of support, secure cooperation with local vaccination clinics. What happens if people refuse? How do we handle that? Well, we would lean on our disciplinary process. Is that our view is that this is a lawful and reasonable direction, and that we would comply with our obligations under the EA in dealing with employee discipline matters, or as general law prior to terminating the employee's employment. Issues around record privacy, Trent spoke about that already, and that's ensuring the confirmation of it's kept in a central location where safety and HR staff have access. It doesn't even sit on our HRIS. It's a separate shared drive that's secured by only 4 people in our business, and we use that to track our progress. On-site vaccination programs, we've entertained that. We're still not averse to that. Where it makes sense, we will bring it on site, but at the moment there just hasn't been a huge drive or a request from our staff to do that. Workers' compensation management, a bit of noise coming from the union on that. We'll seek legal advice and adjust accordingly. Industrial relations management and vaccination complacency and fear, and the things that we were dealing with here is just an omni-channel communication experience required. So through virtual, through toolbox talks, town hall, as many face-to-face sessions as we can, leveraging our frontline leaders, and less so the boffins in corporate head office, people like myself. We have a forum that we address, the leadership addresses our staff through, and they're our virtual town halls. Next slide, thanks, Mario. So I'm just going to quickly run through this, if we can go through, Mario, and I just want to explain the nature of what we're doing here. Over to the next slide, Mario. This kit here is that we've been approached by many organisations who are saying, look, we're having trouble developing our collateral, our policies. What are you guys doing, and how have you put together your support program? What questions are your staff being asked? What happens if, and what would you do in these certain circumstances? So everything we're developing here, our model vaccination policy, our model clauses, our model Q&As, our model FAQs, Everything we have, our model announcements, we're making available to organisations who reach out and ask for it. So far, there's been about 8 companies that have approached me directly. We've had conferences with them, myself and the company director and company secretary, and one of our directors, Warren Brandt, have made ourselves available for people to contact us directly. Yes, we're being inundated with calls. Yes, many people are interested, but we feel so strongly about our leadership obligation here, and we think there's a bigger agenda here, and that's doing everything we possibly can as an employer to render lockdowns as more the exception than the rule. So that offer is to anybody who's on call now here. You can see my mobile number, my contact details, Warren's. If you would like for us to speak to your team, your management teams, or would like any of this information, we're developing a kit right now that we're more than happy to share with and distribute. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Mario.
Thanks, Rob. You did well to get through so much content in 25 minutes or so, and I think the leadership that SPC is showing on this topic is, it's really quite important. So, for anyone on the call who wants a bit more information, please reach out to Rob and Warren. I hope your inbox can cope with a lot of emails, because I suspect you'll be getting a few emails off the back of this session.
It'll just have to.
So as we approach the last 10 minutes of the session, it's important that we think about what the implications are from a workers' comp and a general insurance perspective. But just starting with workers' comp, I'll hand over to a colleague of mine, Calum, who's going to take us through some of the key things that we should be thinking about.
Thanks, Mario. So I suppose one of the key questions we get a lot from clients around mandatory vaccination is, if something goes wrong and someone becomes ill as a result of a vaccination, what is their insurance response, and do we have protection? So there's a few key themes that sit around this. The first is that every Australian state and territory has a no-fault workers' compensation scheme in place. Now, the legislation is different in every state because it is a state-based compensation act. However, underpinning all of the acts is a pretty similar concept, which is that if you suffer an injury, it's compensable if it happens during the course of employment. If you suffer from a disease, then it is compensable if employment was the main, a significant, or a substantial contributing factor to the manifestation of the disease. Now, the exact wording and test does actually vary between each jurisdiction. Next slide, please, Mario. So if we then start thinking through, am I going to have a mandatory vaccination program in my business, and what are the sorts of claims I could get? There are some pretty obvious ones that stand out to us. The first is you may have claims for a COVID-19 infection, and realistically, you may have those whether you have a vaccination program or not. Importantly, in Western Australia and New South Wales, there is actually some presumptive legislation that's been brought in there, where it is assumed if someone has an infection, if they're in a prescribed occupation, that it is work-related unless the employer can prove otherwise. We then get into adverse reactions from a COVID vaccination. Now, that could be, I suppose, where people's thought immediately goes to, which is there is some adverse medical condition, or in the case of one of the vaccines, blood clotting and the like. The second and more common examples that could happen is someone has a vaccination, passes out, and knocks out some teeth. So they are other things that could happen as a consequence of a vaccination program. The third is the trickier one, which is psychological injuries. Now, these could be from a range of reasons. It could be that people are putting in claims for psychological injuries because of being required to have a vaccination, or similarly, you might have people putting in claims because they are fearful of being forced to work in a workplace that doesn't have a vaccination program, and they don't want to have to work alongside unvaccinated workers. Just on the right, there's a few stats around how many COVID-related claims that have been in the scheme so far, and what you'll see there is in 2020 there are actually 212 claims for psychological injuries associated with COVID. On to the next slide, Mario. So the real question for clients is, well, if there is an adverse reaction, is it compensable? And the answer to this is, well, it depends. Firstly, was it an injury or was it a disease? So if we look at the example of someone who, passes out after a vaccination and knocks out their teeth, it's a pretty straightforward, that is an injury. If it's a disease, then it becomes far more complicated about, was it the vaccination that caused it and to what extent was employment a contributing factor? And when they look at that, they'll then look at questions like, was it a mandatory vaccination program or was it voluntary? Was it delivered at the workplace or away from the workplace? And what sorts of inducements were provided by the employer, such as vaccination leave as an obvious one. Next slide, Mario. The other big question we get is, could the employer be sued? Now, across all of the workers' comp jurisdictions, some have common law and some don't. Typically, where there is common law, there is also a threshold test which says that you need to, as an example, have a whole person impairment above 15%. Now, unlike the statutory benefits under workers' compensation, if an employer is to be sued, they actually need to demonstrate negligence on behalf of the employer rather than simply that the condition was work-related. Workers' comp policies respond to common law claims. So in the same way that if there is a statutory claim for compensation, a policy responds, it's the same situation for common law, provided you have adhered to the other terms and conditions of the policy, and obvious ones are things like reasonable precautions. So the key message around this is, in the event that you do have an adverse reaction suffered by one of your workers, then you do have insurance in place and that insurance will respond to those injuries. The last one, which there are still some question marks about, is the government announced vaccination scheme. There are very limited details on this at the moment in terms of how that is going to interoperate with state-based schemes. We would imagine that the likely outcome is that a state-based workers' compensation scheme will be the first port of call, and the federal government's COVID vaccine indemnity scheme will become really the backup in the event that there is a reaction that turns out not to be compensable. Thanks for your time, Mario.
Thanks, Callum. So as we approach the end of the session, perhaps one of the things that we're not all potentially thinking about is any insurance related implications. So for the last couple of minutes of the session, we're going to just briefly touch on insurance related implications. So we'll get Paul Smith to give us a very brief overview of things to consider, in particular from a directors and officers liability insurance. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Mario, and welcome all, and apologies for being the bookend of this conversation, but I think it's important to understand some of the other insurance implications here. Very quickly, if I might, your directors and officers insurance policy is written on a claims made and claims reported basis. And that seems pretty simple. You have a claim made against you during the policy period, you report it during that policy period. This is such a complex weave of issues that we just haven't really worked out what it's going to look like in 6 months, 12 months time. What about when you have a circumstance that might give rise to a claim? What obligations have you got under your D&O policy? And I think given the muddiness of these sorts of issues, I think it'll be important that you as a steward of your business keep on top of these issues and having conversations with your broker. Are these circumstances that have arisen in your business? Somebody perhaps is unfortunately taken very ill as a result of a vaccination which has taken place in your office. What sort of obligation you have and should you notify your D&O insurance? So that's my first tip, just to be mindful of. Second tip for mine is, for some of our organisations last year, and I think of aged care in particular, it was extremely difficult to get them insurance on their directors and officers and public liability insurance without some sort of COVID exclusion. So for certain industries, we now have clients who have under their D&O and public liability insurance COVID exclusions, and they're quite broad. So all of this we're talking about now, could we fall awry of a policy that now might respond to some of these issues? So I think it's worth a check on terms of your policies, just to make sure there are any specific issues they're brought to management's attention, that you understand the risk that you're carrying when you make some of these risk-based assessments that Trent and Rob mentioned. The other things that come into this mix, we know that directors and officers insurance is a personal protection cover for directors and officers. It's not a protection for the company per se. But the problem is with some of these issues, as we find out under, say, our statutory liability insurance facility, is that in the early days, if there's a death or a serious injury of an employee, we might know for some 18 months, perhaps 2 years before we know which, or whether it's individual or the company is going to be investigated by work health and safety. So what other supplementary insurances are there to start covering some of our legal bills, some of our investigative costs that might be associated with that particular issue? And I should say, under our statutory liability solution, that 70% of known claims to date have been in the work health and safety space. So it stands to reason that we're going to see a rise of these sorts of claims coming in this particular area. But what it does is also provide complementary cover to the company, so a policy response to the company. So again, check with your broker the adequacy, the need for your business. Is this something that you might want to consider in complement to your D&O insurance? I should also say, just step back, sorry, to the exclusion for a moment. For some of you, you might have a management liability policy, and there are typical bodily injury and property damage exclusions in every D&O and management liability policy. That's standard. The problem is that they may go beyond what the intent was meant to be. So if there is a workers' comp claim, it falls to workers' comp insurance. That's not surprising. But if there's a subsequent or a consequential work health and safety investigation of an individual, a director or an officer, then that falls to your D&O policy. That bodily injury exclusion I'm just talking about is really critical to whether you have that secondary coverage. And it's all around the preamble language in that exclusion. Anything arising from, attributable to, or in consequence of bodily injury is hereby excluded. So not only does it exclude the workers' comp claim, because that's meant to be another insurance, but those subsequent investigations could be excluded. Again, typically more found in management liability insurance policies for SMEs, less so for large organisations buying a more complex D&O policy. The other tip, if I can just leave you on this note, we're already starting to see insurers are starting to ask questions in the last couple of weeks about your risk-based assessment. What have you done on this particular issue? What are you doing on this issue? Did you seek some independent advice? Did you seek some guidance from Rob and his team on what they've done? Did you speak to Trent and his team? You know, what are the tools kits that you've drawn upon and how you're deploying it, how you're managing and messaging that to your employees, to your contractors and like, to the broader community? These are sorts of things that are going to be part of the assessment kit that insurers will look at you. And so be prepared to have those sorts of conversations. On that note, Murray, I'll close out there.
Thanks, Paul. Well, we're certainly towards the back end of the session, just judging by the number of questions coming through. There's a lot of interest, and people are curious to get more information. So, you know, I think, you know, perhaps the best way to deal with the large volume of questions will be for anyone that's got any particular questions, please direct them to any of the presenters today. There's just simply too many of them for us to cover. So, you know, Trent will no doubt be happy to support anyone through any of the legal questions. Rob Tanti and SPC have offered not only to provide advice and their own experiences, but also to even provide people with copies of their policies and procedures, which is an amazing resource, which I think, you know, most of us should explore. And then of course Caleb on the workers' comp and Paul on the general insurance. So with that in mind, you know, I think the summary of today's event is pretty clear. You know, I think you know, vaccination is certainly, you know, it appears to be the only lever left in order for us to get out of the current situation that you know, that we're facing as a country. So employers need to really invest in thinking about what this means for us from a workplace perspective, and you know, certainly start with doing a COVID-19 vaccination risk assessment, really covering the elements that Trent covered, and then perhaps use some of the learnings from Rob's presentation on SPC and really get some technical and legal advice where required. So I'd like to just thank everyone for dialing in. We know it's a fair commitment of time, and it's such a massive topic for us all. It's really important that we've been able to to cover it. I wish we had another 3 or 4 hours. We could have covered each one of these topics for so much longer. Having said that, everyone who's registered for the event will be getting an email within the next 24 hours with a link to a recording of the webinar, as well as the slides. So if there's anything within the content that we've covered that you want more information on, please just reach out. So again, thank you everyone for dialing in, and thanks to each of the speakers. We really appreciate your time, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thank you.